Welcome to the College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line. Here's Shehan J. Haraja and Bobak Hayeri.
Hey everybody, it's the College Football Survivor Show. I'm Bobak Hayeri with my co-host Shehan J. Raja, national college football writer for CBS Sports. It's another wonderful week of the offseason, and teams are preparing for the fall with spring practices and upcoming spring games. You know, they're taking stock of who they return, who they brought in before, they might even have to go do some shopping in the upcoming portal window. In this episode, we're going to take a look at some of the notable freshmen to watch as teams reload. But before we dive in, let me remind you that you can find us on X and TikTok at CFB Survivor Show, where we have video highlights of the show, run polls, and listen to your feedback. Take a moment to like, rate, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. Now, at the outset, I want to let all of our listeners know that Shehan has written a really good piece on this topic at cbssports.com. It's a good read. I recommend after you listen to us, you go and check that out. But first of all, Shehan, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good. Yeah, it's been a busy couple of days. Actually, my daughter got baptized last weekend, so we had a lot of family in town, and we were very, very tired. And so it's been good to kind of just get back to normal life. Actually, the baby's like sleeping a lot better now that she's not just surrounded by like 20 people at all times. So, yeah, doing great.
I love that because it's one of those things as a parent, when you're a new parent, you get kind of a little annoyed when everyone wants to like handle the baby when you just want it to go to sleep or they want to hang around. And some parents are good about that. I mean, some former parents especially are kind of like, oh no, I've been there, frankly, my approach is like, I already went through this. It's your baby, man, in terms of some of this stuff. But I love it. That's great. And I'm glad she's sleeping better because that's wonderful for everyone involved. My goodness. But, as we've been talking a little bit about the spring games and what to look out for and the spring practices. But with spring games themselves, I think it's a good time to kind of first talk about how to examine them. I know you've talked about it in a previous episode, but how should fans who watch, and assumably most fans are just going to watch their own team spring games. They're not necessarily scouting everyone out there. But for those who are interested in watching a spring game, what are the things you recommend looking out for?
Yeah. I think spring games are interesting, and maybe we can in a second get into a little bit of a discussion of kind of spring in general and how kind of it's been impacted. For me, I think that what you're looking for is you got to look big picture, right? Like you can't be looking too much. You're not going to give too much away scheme wise. You're not going to give too much away about like a quarterback battle or something like that. What you're really looking for more than anything else is just for things that maybe aren't what you expect, right? Whether it's, maybe a young player who is getting on the field with the ones, maybe that's a player to keep an eye on. Maybe it's, sort of more specific skill things, right? Like how somebody's getting off the line, whether they've grown, for example. It's just an opportunity to get players that you haven't seen in a while and you won't see for a few more months in live action. And I think the other piece too is that, again, I think that when you're evaluating a player, you want to do it much more in the context of that individual player. Like, what are they doing? What are they doing better than they were doing last year? What are they struggling with? More than like, oh, well, this unit is awesome, right? Like, for example, people are going to see either good or bad offensive line play in these spring games. And truly, that probably does not mean a whole lot. You can't necessarily tell a whole lot because this is an offense too that's gone against the same defense for several weeks. The defense is going to pick up advantages over the offense in a lot of ways. So I think that the big thing is you don't want to have too many big picture takeaways from these spring games. It's more to look at the details. It's more to look at how they're doing things. They're going to be teams, for example, that change up what they do schematically. They're not going to give away too much, but I remember back in 2019, all of a sudden, Joe Burrow's like legitimately in the shotgun now. They're legitimately lining up forward receivers wide. They didn't give us a whole lot more than that, but they at least let us know, no, we're doing things differently now. There's a famous story from Georgia Tech's first spring game post Paul Johnson when Jeff Collins lines up in the flex bone and then the quarterback audibles and they move into the spread because they were trying to make a statement about the fact that they're not running the flex bone anymore. And So, that's kind of the bigger picture things you have to look for. Again, you're not going to figure out, hey man, our secondary rotation looks great against their teammates. That's not necessarily something that you're going to figure out. It's more, what's the order that guys are coming out, who's playing with who looks maybe a little bit physically better from an individual skill perspective. And that's probably the better way to watch than, oh wow, we have the best running game in the country this year because we played well in the spring game.
Yeah, I guess maybe I'm more worried if the two team or the other defense actually runs over the first team offense or vice versa. Then you're a little bit more concerned. But as you said, like I'm sure, for example, I admit I did not watch last year's spring USC game, but I wonder how that defense looked in that game versus then how they ended up looking against actual teams that were competing as hard as they could. Or that they were unfamiliar with. I think that's a better statement, that they were unfamiliar with going into that. And speaking of coaching statements, I mean, totally nothing about on the field, but nothing will ever beat Bo Pelini walking out with a cat at Nebraska. That one, the reference to Faux Pelini in the memes coming out there like the Lion King. That moment, that was a moment where the whole internet, I felt at least the college football internet, just stopped for a moment to admire.
I think that broke contain from college. Yeah. Like I think that was one that went mainstream.
Because, and again, we've talked about this on and off, but I love the fact that college has started to embrace silliness more. And that was one of, I think, those pivotal moments, because now, or at least loosiness. Like it's what I like about Brett Yormark and what he does, obviously over at the Big 12, and willing to kind of embrace some of these kind of lighter ideas. But I don't want to get too far into that, but that's just.
Yeah. Well, I had a question too for you. You've obviously been around college football a little longer than me. Do you feel like spring, just as like in general, like the coverage, the spring game, all that sort of stuff, it feels to me, just in the 10 years that I've been around the sports, like it feels a little less like, it feels like it's lost some juice. It feels like there used to be a time when and maybe it's because we have a 12-month a year conversation period. And so the talk never truly stops. I think another factor too is that college basketball used to be a once the football season ended all the way till the end of March sport. Now it's just a March sport. Nobody really pays attention outside of just March. So maybe that takes away as well. And beat writers are obviously much more involved than on the basketball side for that 1 month. I don't know. I feel like even just a couple years ago, it felt like we got more stories from spring, that we got more, interesting spring games, things like that. Maybe it's also just that the portal means that you don't even know if this is going to be your roster. I'm sure that's probably a factor as well. But I'm curious if that's something that you've noticed. Do you feel a little less engaged in some ways with spring now than maybe a couple years ago?
Yeah, no, I see where you're going with this, and as it made me kind of think. I think for a while, and this is, again, for me, the perspective is about 25 years, I guess, at this point, which is terrifying to say that. But I feel like it got more interest increased, particularly in the 2000s, as I think cable started to pick up more of the spring games and put them on whatever, minor channel that they were just looking for filler content. Right. And then some of the more high profile teams, especially for those who weren't around when USC under Pete Carroll was at its peak, the amount of interest was off the chart for that team. It got crazy. And that's part of why I think you could argue the NCAA got really mad at USC and wanted to really hammer them, because they're like, why are all these celebrities on the sideline? It was borderline professional in so many ways, and they didn't like it. Right. But there was that moment. And then you started to see when Alabama took off. That was, the famous watching all those fans run across the field to get in line for signatures. It became it felt like it started to build momentum and build and get bigger and bigger. But I agree. It seems like, especially in the last several years, the volume has gone down a little bit. And you brought up potential reasons that are interesting. I mean, is it the portal? Is it the fact that perhaps I wonder if it's more the 24-hour cycle? And I'm not sure how savvy fans are in general, how much more savvy. I don't know if the baseline is increased, but I think some people are also more realistic about what goes on in the spring. A lot of programs have also had spring games that aren't really traditional. They're well, we're going to more scrimmage. We're not going to actually really have a game kind of approach. So I wonder if some of those things, as well as just the understanding that what you see in the spring, this would be a savvier fan, isn't necessarily reflective of how the team's going to perform against other teams come fall. But I agree. It seems like it isn't quite as intriguing as it has been before. Despite, for example, with this season, as we've talked about in previous shows, there are some interesting, matchups, interesting position battles out there, particularly at some of the more higher profile quarterback spots. So, yeah, I think there's something to be said there. Kind of.
Well, and I do want to give a shout out to Texas A&M because Mike Elko, their new coach there, is the opposite in so many ways of Jimbo Fisher. Ironically, his former employer as a defensive coordinator. Elko kind of went out and was like, "Look, we're going to play a real game. We're going to have a draft. We're going to pick teams, and we're going to play a legitimate football game for our spring game." And while obviously not every team always did a true game, it felt like it was more in that direction in the past. And I think that a big part of this too is like programs and coaches just in a lot of ways it feels like continue to screw
Mhm,
fans
mhm,
and make the experience less fun and less watchable and less worth your time. I know that I've been to spring games and seen spring games where it's like you're basically just like doing some like not even like glorified practice stuff, like,
mhm.
oh, we're gonna put them in these situations and try it out, and it's like that's so
Yeah.
boring. The other thing that I hate too, and like this I get a little bit more, but like is the whole like modified scoring thing where like the defense can score points on the offense. And I don't know, man, like just let's try playing some football, let's have some fun with it. And I think one thing in general is you just see programs, it feels like, moving away from doing anything in service of fans.
Mhm.
They're kind of just like, well, you're there. We don't have to do anything for you. We don't have to be interesting or be entertaining. We're just gonna kind of show up and you're gonna deal with whatever it is that we give you. And again, I hope that that's changing a little bit. I think one thing is you look at like a Mike Elko and just that style of coach, like a legit ball coach. I mean, he wants football to speak for itself. He's not going out there, collecting plaques with fake national championship dates on it, right? Like he's extremely footballing it. And I think that we are seeing a bit more of a reversion back to like the ball coach type coach.
Mhm.
And I'm hoping that with that, we get a little bit more interest on the football side. Because I'll tell you what, I mean, I enjoy football, right? I want to watch people play football against competition and less like, hey, here's like some, here's some scraps to throw off the table to you.
You know, it's kind of interesting too. I wonder how much of this, like, if they're trying to maximize the amount of money they can get out of their teams, like, why don't they do something more to like make it more attractive to the fans in the offseason for that reason, And you made me think of probably my favorite could they go like a 6 versus 6 like go 6 man could tackle football just for it wouldn't really tell anybody anything, but it would be entertaining and probably less tackling because that's just the nature of that particular version of the sport. But I was thinking like my favorite version of Spring Game, and I know I've mentioned it before, and it's hot on my mind only because I literally, right before we started recording the show, had these helmets delivered and some stuff from Japan. But their spring games are hilarious because they do an exhibition season of underclassmen against underclassmen. Like there's no set schedule, like they'll have between 4 and 6 games. And you just get a chance to see your team play. That would be interesting, although a little more higher risk, just because I think the idea of someone getting injured would really would end that pretty quick. Because there's already things that happen in spring practice, spring game that can really throw a team for a loop. What should folks who are watching spring games, as we kind of go into talking about the freshmen to look out for, how should fans look at the freshmen? Do they look at how they're being used or how they're acting in the circumstances they're being thrust into? What would you look for if you were trying to examine how a freshman might be used in the fall?
Yeah, I think that a big piece of it is just see who they're playing with, right? Are the guys who are playing with the ones are guys who are going to have a chance. And most programs, especially during spring games, they do rotate guys, right? Like you're not just necessarily putting out 11 guys and they're sticking out there, especially let's say at a position like receiver. But If you are an offensive lineman, if you are a defensive end and you're finding your way onto the field next to other starters, that's a good indicator that you're making some waves. And the other thing too is just the total amount of snaps that you get a chance to be on the field. You know what? When you have a freshman who you like a lot, who's impressed in the spring, like you're trying to get them reps. And while again, not every team is doing a legitimate game, I think that getting live reps in front of actual fans in the actual stadium, there is a value to that that I think a lot of coaches do understand. That you want to see how they respond to the eyes and the pressure and the broadcast and those dynamics. So I think more than anything else, you just want to see who's getting on the field
Mhm.
and who they're with. You know, if there are guys who are running out with the ones, I think that that's a good indicator that whether, again, like what I would not get caught up in is stats, right? Like if somebody has a breakaway 73-yard touchdown, they might not be a legitimate player. I remember I went to Texas Tech spring game a couple of years ago, and they had this like walk-on track star receiver who just went absolutely insane and had like 160 yards receiving in the game because he was just like a breakaway type player, and he never played when we got to the fall. So I think you want to contextualize it,
Mhm.
and numbers themselves don't necessarily matter, but it's trying to figure out what role guys are being used in, what they're being asked to do, and I think that that's probably the best indicator.
One thing we certainly can say is it's harder than ever for true freshmen to break into the starting lineup in the fall because of the transfer portal. The transfer portal is allowed plug and play, so to have a true freshman who can be a ready to go, just turnkey plug and play person is difficult. Especially at some positions. I think wide receiver, just by the nature of it, it's closer. I always said, like, the way I compare wide receiver, I was trying to explain it to someone who wasn't necessarily a football fan. I'm like, it's more like basketball in that your physical development is important, but it's not as critical as it can be for someone who's really on the line and going to be pushing guys all day long. It's more of a basketball. You can run, catch, and be physical, and you can certainly get better as your physical development goes on.
What they say is the closer you are to the ball, the harder it is for you to come in and contribute right away,
Mhm.
because just the physicality is just different. If you're a center, not only do you need to be big and physical to go up against collegiate defensive tackles, you also need to be able to make all the checks and
You can
protections,
be
and that's a
sharp.
difficult thing to do. Quarterback is obviously kind of its own thing, but it's hard
Mhm.
for a first year freshman quarterback to come in and do that. Whereas you get out to receiver, you get out to cornerback, these are more one-on-one type battles. And certainly you're going to get beat more times than you win as a freshman, but you're not going to get destroyed. You're not going to physically be turned to dust, right? Safety, similar deal. Like it's going to take you some time to catch up, but physically you can hold up. We saw Caleb Downs last year is a great example of this. And running backs kind of in between
Mhm.
these things where uh, in the right situation. If you're a running back who's going to run right up the middle, that's probably a tougher place for you to step in right away. If you're somebody who's going to get to the edge, maybe it's a little easier.
Caleb Downs. He proved himself at Alabama and made his way to Ohio State. Like I'm sure that made Crimson Tide fans thrilled to see that one go out there. But I wanted to now let's take a look. I love the article you put together for CBSSports.com, but you put it together obviously some of the big names and some names that maybe those who aren't as fanatical about college football may know off the top of their head. But who in your mind, who's the number one or top tier? We don't necessarily have to rank them in order. Who's been the player that in your mind really is most likely to just jump in and be not only a starter but a national name very quickly?
Yeah, well, I will say somebody who is number one, and to me in a class of his own as a freshman right this second, and that's Jeremiah Smith, the wide receiver at Ohio State. And I say this for a couple of reasons. One, he was the number one recruit when things finished up in the top 247 rankings. So, obviously the evaluators thought that he was pretty special in a wide receiver class. By the way, that was pretty special. And we'll get to some other guys in just a second. Um, the other thing too is that he's stepping into a room where they kind of need some instant production at his specific profile, somebody who's a bigger body, who's able to go up and get the ball. For people who don't know him, he, again, was the number one recruit, a wide receiver out of Miami, Florida. A lot of programs pushed hard to get him at the end there. The University of Miami reportedly was like dropping NIL deals left and right to try to convince him to change his mind. But Ohio State has been a factory of wide receivers, and he decided to stick with it. And since he got there in the spring, he actually became the fastest freshman ever to lose his black stripe, which is a tradition that Ohio State does and has done since 2012, where basically you have to earn your official roster spot is the idea. And once you earn your roster spot, you get a black stripe taken off of your helmet and you get to wear the actual scarlet stripe that Ohio State, of course, wears. He did it faster than anybody. He actually tied the fastest time ever by any player, transfer or freshman, since 2012, which is pretty impressive. So they clearly believe that he's going to have a chance to be good right away. And I think the other thing too is he's not going to necessarily need to be wide receiver 1 in 2024. They've got Emeka Egbuka coming back. They've got Carnell Tate coming back. But I think he has to factor into the rotation for this Ohio State team to be the kind of team that we want them to be on the offensive side of the ball. And so far, the reviews out of camp have been pretty incredible that, again, they lost one of the best wide receivers of the past decade in college football, and they feel like they've got a guy who's maybe going to be able to fill some of that gap.
You know, we were talking about that last push for other teams that were trying to get him. I mean, John Ruiz couldn't have had worse timing for him to not be able to just throw tons of money that he may or may not have had available to actually throw for the Hurricanes. You know, you're right. And it's funny, too, because I'm glad you pointed that out, because that's one thing listeners should keep in mind. For some of these freshmen, it's not that, especially when there are a core of people like receivers, we're not necessarily talking about someone who's going to be the next Marvin Harrison Jr. right out the gate. We're looking for someone to be part of that rotation of the starters, because obviously everyone who knows football knows there's more than one receiver out there. But to be able to step up to match what people expect, and then perhaps over the season or over multiple seasons reach that peak that everyone expects him to be. And absolutely, I think he's a great choice for number 1. And I do love that black stripe thing. Urban Meyer, that was one of the better ideas he had that I think is a lasting legacy. And I'm sure they'll keep that one at Ohio State, even after whenever there's another coaching transition. On behalf of Buckeyes, I hope you guys beat Michigan, so there is not another coaching transition anytime soon. But moving on, though, one of the other names that were out there, and I know this person may not be, well, he's a national name, but I don't know if he's necessarily going to get the spot. I've seen, it's so funny. You ask different experts, and some people think he's going to be the day one starter. Some people think that he may not be. But Nebraska's Dylan Raiola, I mean, his whole recruitment story, we've talked about it. One of the bigger stories out there, obviously, switching from Nebraska to Georgia, then Georgia and moving to Georgia, and then deciding, you know what, I'd like to go back to Nebraska. And obviously his dad's history there, his jerseys was retired. So much of a story there. And you kind of, I just want to say, though, they've also got, you know, an excellent recruit that was coming there as quarterback anyway with Daniel Kalen before suddenly, again, Raiola decided you want to go there. So there is talent in that quarterback room. But when I was talking, you know, each of the guys you put on your list, I was thinking, like, who are they stepping in for? And for Dylan Raiola, I just put like steps in for competent quarterback play, which has been lackluster at Nebraska. Because when was the last time Nebraska had a really good quarterback?
I mean, are we like how good do you think Tommy Armstrong was? Like, I think that like that's probably the last time they had pretty good quarterback. I mean, like, Adrian Martinez wasn't a terrible player, but it just never quite worked. And then he went to Kansas State and was a much better player than he ever was. Like, so, like, I feel like the answer is probably Tommy Armstrong. Is that the best answer that we've got?
I think that's reasonable. Yeah.
It's been a few years. No, so it's interesting now, right? You mentioned Dylan Raiola comes in. He at a moment was the number 1 overall recruit. He ended up slipping a bit. from my perspective, the difference between being the number 1 and number 7 player in the country is pretty negligible. I think you're going to be all right if you get one of those guys, especially at the quarterback position. You mentioned it. He had moved. He actually started in my neck of the woods at Burleson High School, just south of Fort Worth, playing for John Kitna, actually, who was the head coach over there, the former Cowboys quarterback. Then he moves from there, moves out to Arizona, moves to Georgia, like you mentioned. I think he ended up going to 4 different high schools when it was all said and done, which is always a weird deal and a bit funny that he ultimately ended up with 3 collegiate commitments, with first Ohio State, then Georgia, then Nebraska. But he's there now. He made it finally to Nebraska. And I think that there's a couple things you have to like. One, he's a bigger guy. Like, he's listed right now at 230 pounds. And if you're going to be the quarterback at Nebraska right now, you probably got to be able to survive some stuff, especially as a freshman, because they have not been an awesome pass blocking team over the past few years. That's maybe been a bigger issue than quarterback play alone. And especially last year with Jeff Sims and Heinrich Harburg, they ran the quarterback a lot. I don't expect them to do that the same way with Dylan Raiola. I think they're going to try to get him some help at running back, but I do think that that's a good factor for him being able to compete for that starting job right away. I think another piece too is that, you know, they've tried to step up that wide receiver position as well, just to get him a little bit ready. Like you said, I don't know if he's the day 1 starter, less because of his ability and more because of what he's going to be asked to do. But I think that he will be the starter by the end of the year. And this is going to be the first opportunity that you kind of get to see him come in and compete against collegiate competition. And he played, like you mentioned, in a high level of Georgia high school football. This is not going to be the craziest jump that somebody makes. Like, he was playing against good players. And by the way, in practice, he was going against another guy on this list, KJ Bolden at Georgia, who was his teammate at Buford High School, a fellow 5-star. So I think he's more ready than most for this moment. But the other piece too, if you're Matt Rule, is that the 2024 season essentially does not actually matter. You don't need to win anything right now. I think it would be nice to make a bowl game if you could. That probably is what you need to do. But the real thing that you need to do is get him ready for his future. They want him to be the savior of this program in some ways. I will say, glancing at the schedule, it actually works out okay for him to be the day 1 starter. And actually, the hard part is the latter half of the schedule. So I don't even know if he's a midseason quarterback change. That might not be the move, because you go UTEP, Colorado, Northern Iowa, Illinois. Illinois is a good defense, but nothing crazy. At Purdue versus Rutgers, at Indiana. All those games are very winnable. And I mean, again, Illinois is a good defense, but they just lost Jerzon Newton to the NFL, so he's not going to destroy you necessarily. And so I think you feel pretty okay with that through 7 games. Then you go at Ohio State. That's not going to be very fun. Versus UCLA, at USC, versus Wisconsin, at Iowa. That last 5-game stretch, not going to be the most fun. They're probably going to go 1-4 through that stretch, I'd imagine. But maybe you're at the point, if you start him for the first 7 games, let's say, and maybe they do a part-time, I don't know. I think they'll find some way to break him in. But if you get to, let's say that they go 6-1, which would get them to a bowl game, so which I think they'd be perfectly happy with through the first couple. I think, at Ohio State, that's going to be a disaster. I don't even waste your time with it. At Iowa, that's going to be a really tough game, just with the way that they play defense. If you can just give one of USC or Wisconsin some trouble, right? Like if you can just make them sweat, if Dylan Raiola can kind of have a breakout game, especially at USC, I think that's going to be an interesting game. Obviously, defensively, they're revamping a lot, but they're not the toughest defense that he's going to have to go against. So if you're able to just kind of keep pace at USC, I think that there's more to be gained than lost, even if you go 1-4 across those last 5 games. So I think I'm talking myself into it. I think I do want Dylan Raiola to be the
because I was thinking if they go with Harburg, and now I'm imagining a Colorado game, deep into the second half and Colorado's got an edge, do they then like, okay, like this not against our hated rival, which is the only hated rival of Nebraska. My goodness, like it's fun to imagine the scenarios. Gosh knows I've seen a couple of games where suddenly in game 2 or game 3, they're like, all right, you know what? We were talking about this guy as a quarterback of the future. The future is now. We said that was a past tense. Now it's a future.
Yeah. I could see definitely them starting Harburg against UTEP and then bringing Raiola in the second half if things look good. And then maybe Harburg starts against Colorado. They get off to a slow start. And then, like you said, Raiola comes in and, we see what happens. I could definitely see that happening. That Nebraska Colorado game, again, it's not going to matter for anything, but it's just going to be a really fascinating game. Because, I think that in so many ways it defined both of these team seasons last year. Like if Nebraska wins that game, then they go to a bowl. And if Colorado loses that game, then like the Dion thing doesn't happen. Like, I mean, obviously it would have beaten TCU, but it would have been like, yeah, well, they just had this crazy lucky game against TCU, and then like that was kind of it. But like because they won it, they were able to get that 3-game winning streak right at the beginning of the year, and the attention stayed on them. And so like that game was very consequential last year, and I think it could be this year too.
Sticking with Colorado, you also mentioned Jordan Seaton, the huge recruit for the number 1 offensive tackle in the class of 2024 by 247. Are they putting too much? Because we've talked about the Colorado offensive line situation, but is this? I mean, we're basically expecting him to start, but is this going to be, do you think, too much for a freshman? Because that's a concern. I mean, that's something where, as we were just talking about earlier, these are the guys that are on the line. They're physically, they have to be already developed, and he's going to be going against some tough hombres across the board. I mean, what do you think here? I mean, can he do it?
Are they putting too much on him? I think yes, obviously they're putting too much on him. And something to remember too is, well, one, we likely mentioned being a lineman as a freshman trying to play major college football is really difficult. But the other piece too is, remember, they landed a 5-star cornerback in Cormani McLean last year, and dude couldn't get on the field. Like he was not ready, and the staff essentially acknowledged it. And Dion even called him out multiple times over the course of the season for just not practicing right, not being ready. And I actually give him a lot of credit for the way that they handled that, because I think that it would have been very easy to just let him ride. Now, I don't think that Jordan Seaton, personality-wise, is very much like Cormani McLean. I don't think they're very similar at all. But it's a big jump going from that to this. Something that does help him, he was an IMG Academy kid. So, like, he's played against high-level competition, even, again, just in practice. He was the number 1 offensive tackle in the class. He played in the state of Florida. Obviously, IMG plays a national schedule, so he's playing some of the best teams in the country. So that does help him, I think, in a way, be ready. But, like, I mean, let's just say hypothetically that he is not ready, right? Like let's just say that the staff decides he's not ready. What does Colorado do then? Like they brought in 5 transfers, I believe, after bringing in 7 transfers last year and then putting together the worst offensive line in the country. And I want people to understand, this was in the power conferences, the worst offensive line, like the single worst. They were last in the Power 5 in rushing yards per attempt, last in rushing offense, which some of that has to do with, obviously, their style of play, but like they were inefficient when they ran it too. They allowed more sacks than anybody. And this isn't just also, it's impacted by sack numbers, of course, but this is sack adjusted still. They were the worst rushing offense in the power conferences. They allowed more sacks than anybody. They allowed more pressures than anybody. They were bad at everything. And now they're potentially changing all 5 starters and their offensive line coach, and their top player is supposed to be a 5-star freshman. So like I think that you can fill a hole or two this way, right? Like if Jordan Seaton steps into a situation where you bring back 3 starters and have a guy that you've been developing at the 4th, and then you slot a freshman in, that I think can work. we kind of saw that a little bit with Kelvin Banks at Texas back in 2021. A really good player. And there's a chance, by the way, like Jordan Seaton's special. There's a chance that he does go full Kelvin Banks and he's just ready to go and he's awesome from day one. I still don't think that's enough to save their offensive line, but there's a chance that happens. But like if he doesn't, man, like, I don't know what their pathway is then to like to having a passable offensive line, because you just we don't have to go on the Colorado offensive line rant every single week, but like it's crazy. And the other piece of this too, do you know who they open with next year?
North Dakota State.
North Dakota State in week 1, at Nebraska in week 2, and then at Colorado State in week 3. And so the easy game on that is the team that wants to destroy you more than anybody else in the entire country. And then you open Big 12 play, where you obviously play a 9-game conference schedule. You open with Baylor at UCF, like hopefully you can handle that okay. But then Kansas State, that's not going to be very fun. You play Utah late in the year. You play Oklahoma State. Like there's winnable games on here, but man, it is not going to be fun. And North Dakota State isn't North Dakota State of old, right? Like South Dakota State's kind of taken their mantle, but they are not a fun team to play regardless in week 1. I think Colorado wins that game, but I think even the question is, are they so worn down from playing North Dakota State that going at Nebraska is something that maybe breaks them a little bit? Because they played well when they played teams that tried to get into track meets with them, right? TCU played them like they were trying to get into a track meet. USC played them in a track meet. They played those teams really close. And then Oregon erased them from existence. Like,
Yeah.
And so they're going to play a couple really physical teams early. I think that they will actually have a good game against Colorado State. I don't think that Colorado State in year 2 is going to be able to keep up the same way. But good luck, Jordan. I really hope that they give you the help and support that you need, because otherwise it's not going to be very fun.
Absolutely. Kind of moving on to a couple of some of the other players. I know another wide receiver you brought up was Cam Coleman at Auburn. He's obviously stepping in for just any competent wide receiver play, which is more than just the wide receiver room. Certainly their quarterbacks weren't really performing as they like, but no Tiger had more than 350 yards receiving this past season. So they've got a lot to fix there, and certainly Coleman's going to be expected to at least be part of it. He, as you point out in your article, he's got a good frame, impressive length. Is he going to be enough to at least help restart that offense, that passing offense for Auburn?
Well, I'll tell you what, it's not just Cam Coleman too. You also have to talk about a player who did not enroll early, Perry Thompson, another top 40 wide receiver recruit. They've got a top 150 guy in Malcolm Simmons. They should be really, really good at wide receiver next year. And so, like, to talk about Cam Coleman specifically, number 5 player in the country, only behind Jeremiah Smith in terms of wide receivers. He's a special player. It's honestly like for college football, it's a little bit of a blessing that Ryan Williams ended up sticking with Alabama, because if they had gotten 3 of the top 40 players at wide receiver in the country, that would be pretty special, man. That would be pretty special. So the question for them is going to be, can they get the rest of the offense up to speed? And, I think that Coleman, he gives you a 6'3" frame. He's somebody who's good after the catch. He can go up and get it. A really complete wide receiver prospect in so many ways, and the type of receiver that I think Auburn needs. And so now you have to kind of say, well, is Peyton Thorne going to be able to build some rapport with him? Because they really, really need him to. If it's not Peyton Thorne, do they have a whole lot else to kind of lean on? Do they like the friend? Another guy who's an early enrollee who I think they're going to keep an eye on is Walker White, the freshman quarterback. Is he somebody who can push into the rotation? Holden Geriner's back too. So to me, it's less a Cam Coleman question, and it's more a, can we get Cam Coleman somebody to throw him the ball?
That's a great statement for him, by the way. It's basically like, look, we're not worried about the incoming freshmen. We just need to make sure the rest of the stuff can even use them at this point. It's like, it's funny to draw that comparison with Jeremiah Smith over at Ohio State. Like, can he be a part of this elite offense, this machine that's ready to go? And Cam's the opposite side, like, all right, we got him. Now we just got to make sure the rest of this kind of thing kind of works. I love it. I want to kind of keep us moving a little bit. So switching to the other side of the ball, Kingston Viliamuasa for the linebacker coming into Notre Dame. Obviously, Notre Dame has had a good defense overall. They were losing two good linebackers to the NFL with J.D. Bertrand and Maris Louis Fau. How do you think he's going to fit into this?
Yeah, I think that he's somebody who's going to factor into the rotation early. He's got great size as a freshman coming in and just has the tools to be a full-on linebacker, right? Like to do just a little bit of everything. Sometimes you get guys who are too big. Sometimes you get guys who are too small. He kind of has the whole package. I think he's going to be able to cover very well. I think he's going to be able to get stops at the line. Just in so many ways, I think a perfect modern linebacker. And like you mentioned, at a position of need. Linebacker is an interesting position to try to project because one, it's kind of just about instincts in a lot of ways, and that's something that you can only truly get from film. It's not as much a physical thing, and I think that you really have to like what he's shown so far. And the other piece too is that you have to know how they're gonna kind of stand up and be ready to kind of deal with a college level defense. And one of the things that you have to like about this guy is that he's coming from St. John's Bosco, obviously one of the top high school programs in the country as well, just like IMG Academy, but on the West Coast. And so he's played in a more modern defense, in a more professionalized defense. And I think that that's going to make his learning curve just a little better. I know, 247 Greg Bagans, he protects him as a potential top 3 round pick in the 2020, what year will that be? 2026 or 7 NFL draft. So like people kind of think that he's going to have a chance to be ready to go pretty quick. And if he's able to lock down one of those positions, I mean, in some ways, I think linebacker has been, there's so much talk about linebackers dying as a position as we move to nickel kind of rotations and maybe get guys playing more edge or jack roles. But like it's also been because finding good linebackers is really hard. Finding guys who can lock down a position for multiple years and have the versatility to play inside and out, to get to the line, to play in coverage as well. Obviously the obvious comparison is like a Harold Perkins, right? He struggled to find his way to do both those things at a high level. I think that potentially Notre Dame has a really special player here in Viliamuasa to try to kind of fill one of those roles for the next couple of years.
Yeah, I always think of some of the great recruiting battles over the years for linebacker. And it's funny, USC and Notre Dame actually end up fighting for a lot of the same guys at that position. Manny Te'o, I remember going the last second.
Yeah.
I thought there was a real question which team he was going to go to. He went to Notre Dame. Obviously, stellar career there. Right as a freshman, too. He jumped right. He was freshman All-American there. So Notre Dame has a good tradition of some backs, linebackers going in there and just being excellent and being exceptional quick. We talked about another of these guys earlier, but because he played against Raiola, but KJ Bolden, safety at Georgia. A lot of expectations for him. I mean, Georgia has always been great at that position, but they've lost some excellent talent again to the NFL. So we're not necessarily expecting him to step up and be the star of the defense, but hoping that he'll be a contributor as part of an already a strong core. I mean, I know there's, as you point out, Malachi Starks is not going to be playing, is out for the spring. So this is an opportunity for guys like Bolden to step up and show their mettle. What should we know about him?
Well, and it's funny too, you look at my list and some of the guys that I mentioned. I mean, we don't see a lot of the top recruiting class in the country actually represented on this list. And it's not because the top recruits aren't really good, but because there's such a depth of talent at some of these schools and these position groups that coming in and doing it. Like, I don't have a Texas player on the list because I don't necessarily know, even though they have multiple top 10, top 20 players coming in, they have such a depth of talent coming back. I don't know if they're going to contribute. I don't have an Oregon player on the list. They had one of the top class in the country. I don't have a Michigan player. If not for Jeremiah Smith, I wouldn't have had an Ohio State player. But the thing that's special about KJ Bolden, like you mentioned, he has that opportunity to get some reps and some snaps because of Malachi Starks being out. I think that's, from a development perspective, a huge deal for KJ Bolden. The other thing is that, he's come in, and I was reading some coverage over at one of my former employers, actually, Dog Nation, over through the AJC. And one of the things that people are just talking about is that he is physical, man. Like, he is ready to come in. He's not a huge player. He's like 6 foot 190 about, but he's just somebody who comes down, is able to bring great closing speed. And I think that he is somebody who ultimately will factor into that rotation. There's an opening at safety, and he's not as good as Malachi Starks. And Malachi Starks, obviously, as a freshman, is one of the best safeties that we've seen do it, along with Caleb Downs. But I do think that he's somebody who will factor into the rotation, could get in nickel packages, will be a good special teams player right from the start. And again, coming in and having some major reps as an early enrollee, I think will only help that development.
There's another kind of category of freshmen who are coming in and that kind of extend from this. The idea that they're not necessarily going to be the number one guy, but we're looking for people who can be backups and strong backups. And you mentioned, and it's someone who we very, very lightly touched on our previous show, is kind of another potential, spring battle, but probably not. And that's DJ Lagway at Florida. So the question that is, you were framing it, isn't necessarily, is he going to unseat Graham Mertz, but is he going to be the definitive number two, the person that is the backup and potentially the go-to if Mertz doesn't quite, because obviously this is a stressful time in Florida right now in terms of whether or not the coaching staff can stick around. But he was such a big get. What should we know about that?
Yeah, well, Lagway, obviously right in my backyard down in Houston, Texas, and had one of the best senior seasons by a high school player, I think you could argue, in Texas high school football history, and wins Mr. Texas football from my other old employer, Dave Gamble's Texas football. But when you look at DJ Lagway, he got pressured at the end. Texas A&M came calling, some other schools came calling. If he had flipped from Florida, I think legitimately Billy Napier might have been fired.
Mm-hmm.
Like I think that there's a chance that he might have been fired this past December, because what he's been selling is the future, and what he's been selling is hope. And this is the first opportunity that Florida fans are going to get to see to get Lagway out on the field. And Mertz was really good for them last year, so I don't expect a legitimate position battle. And Mertz only has 1 year left anyway, so why make anybody upset? Why rush anything? Especially, by the way, with the dang schedule that Florida has this year, that they're going to feed some people to the wolves, man. But I think that with Lagway coming in, you want to see him kind of live up to the hype. You want to see him make those throws. You want to see him show off his physical ability, show off his understanding of offense. And the other thing too is that for all the pressure that he got to flip and all the people who came late to try to get him, I think that the credit that you have to give to Lagway is that he handled himself very, very well in that last month or so. They never really faltered. They never put out any, inconsistent messages. They always stayed very tight and strong and well communicated with Billy Napier and his staff. And so I think you want to see him handle things the right way in spring as well. And again, that's a little more intangible than just we want to see him throw the ball really far. But I think that he is the future of the program one way or another. And you want to see him understand that responsibility in spring camp, even working as a backup.
Another kind of theme we see in terms of some of these freshmen that you've identified are people who are also not just, stepping in for something that didn't exist or stepping in for a player that's departed, but some are just adding weapons that a team has really probably never even had the caliber of. And you point out someone who is probably the top recruit in program history for them, and that's Micah Hudson, the receiver that's joining Texas Tech. And I do acknowledge they're replacing 3 of their top 4 contributors from the last season, but that's a huge get for Joey McGuire and a program that, while last season injuries kind of kept them from going, there was a lot more hype for Texas Tech, and we're not going to necessarily say what your mark was thinking was going to go, but there were expectations certainly that were higher than what were delivered, and again, injuries had contributed to that, but Joey McGuire landed a big one here. And what should Texas Tech fans expect from him in this upcoming season?
No, it's a huge get, a legacy, by the way. His dad also went to Texas Tech, but he's the first five-star recruit ever to sign with Texas Tech. He's the best receiver recruit that's ever signed with Texas Tech, and they've had some really great receivers come through that program over the years. And you mentioned it. I mean, I think that being able to kind of sit here and say, look, we are heading in the right direction, and people who really matter believe it, on the recruiting trail. And so, you know, even with obviously their struggles last season, they still have back-to-back winning seasons in Big 12 play for the first time since Mike Leach. So they, I think, are doing some things right. And like you mentioned, I mean, Micah Hudson is going to be asked to do a whole lot right away. It reminds me in some ways of Luther Burden in his first season at Missouri, where he comes in and he is just such a dynamic weapon, and he's such a big name that they just had to find ways to get him involved early. And then in year two was really when he took that huge step and became a first team All American type player. So I'm going to be fascinated to see how they use him. And the other piece you have to mention too is that Baron Morton has showed a lot at the quarterback position, and they have another great player coming in Will Hammond as well, who also statistically was one of the top players in the entire country in high school football last year. So it'll be fascinating to watch the dynamic, but I expect him to be a big time player.
So at Oklahoma, does tight end Devon Mitchell, does he fit into this kind of added weapon category? Would you classify his contributions as expected for the Sooners?
Yeah, I think that the obvious candidates to end up on a list like this from Oklahoma's recruiting class, which was really good, were David Stone, the defensive lineman, and Taylor Tatum, the number one ranked running back in the country. But one, the reviews I've heard of Davon Mitchell from camp have been awesome. Like, people are very impressed. He ended up kind of being a mid-tier recruit, but part of that was because he reclassified from the class of 2025 to 2024. But physically, he already looks the part. He's something like 6'4", 245 as a true freshman early enrollee, which, not bad, man. Not bad for being somebody who's supposed to be a junior in high school right now. And I look at that Oklahoma tight end room, which has been a strength of this program over the years. Guys like Austin Stogner, Grant Calcaterra, of course, Mark Andrews in the NFL. And I think that he is the one who has potential star power. There are a lot of good players who are going to factor into the rotation, but I think that he is the potential game breaker. And I'm not going to say that he's going to be able to be a Brock Bowers as a freshman or anything like that, but I think that he is the one in that room who has that kind of upside, who has the sort of game changing upside. And the other piece too is that they're going to be starting a second year player at quarterback in Jackson Arnold, who is going to be playing behind a potentially really troubled offensive line. So having safety blankets is going to be incredibly important. I wouldn't be surprised if Seth Littrell, their new offensive coordinator, runs out multiple tight end sets to get him on the field and to just give Jackson Arnold some help.
I wanted to just step to more of a larger kind of group because they have to do so many replacements due to attrition to the NFL as well as depth losses. And that's the Alabama cornerback position, because there are some people coming in there like Xavier Brown, like Xavier Mincy, Jalen. I actually don't know how to say his last name. Is it Mbakwe? Uh, but I mean,
Buckway, probably,
yeah.
yeah.
What do you expect? I mean, is that going to, and also you get the Kalen DeBoer factor. And that to me is also intriguing when you've now got a new head coach who, he's no one's expecting to be like Nick Saban. I mean, he's going to put his own signature on the program. But when you get a program like that, sometimes you also wonder, like, are there going to be freshmen that are called upon because they fit more what they kind of envision the program to be like? I mean, what do you think? What should we expect for some of the programs like in Alabama, where you've got so many people to replace, but you also recruit like Alabama?
It's a great question. And I think, they're lucky. They have some real experience in the secondary as well. Malachi Moore is coming back. The other Devontae Smith is back as well, playing a key safety role for them. They add a transfer in Domani Jackson, who is obviously coming from your Trojans. And I really think that it's that other spot, that second corner spot, where there is potentially the opportunity for guys to step in. And you mentioned bringing in three guys who have a chance to play as true freshmen. that's what you want to see. I talk all the time. If you're trying to fill a role and you just bring in one player to do it, you're putting a lot on that individual player's shoulders. You want to bring in depth and competition. And I think that Alabama is going to have a chance to do that. And again, I think that even you obviously have to factor in guys like Jaleel Hurley, who's coming back after a redshirt season last year. But to have that level of depth at the cornerback position, it's a great final gift that Nick Saban left. Obviously, a longtime defensive and secondary coach, especially. But I do think that these are guys who can factor in. And the fact, like you said, that there are three of them fighting for playing time instead of just one maybe really good one, I think that puts him in a good position.
Yeah, someone from your neck of the woods, a recruit from Texas, who is on a team that is always happy to play freshmen, happy to get any talent whatsoever. Dante Carter, safety, heading to Vanderbilt, which again, it's Vanderbilt. Talent, any talent is a win, right? They got a 4-star safety coming in. We expect him to start. Should we expect a splash from him? I think that seems likely. I mean, did you follow him at all as a recruit, or?
Just a little bit, but I think that obviously Vanderbilt is a defense-led program. Their head coach is a former linebackers and secondary coach. And I think that the fact that you're able to build some connections, you're able to build kind of an identity for yourself, to be able to get a player, like you mentioned, from Cibolo Steele, a really, really, really good high school program. Actually, Steele is especially known for their defensive backs that they put out in the state of Texas. And actually, they have a fellow early enrollee from the same school in Alvin Williamson playing cornerback. So I think that he's somebody who has a chance to come in right away. Great frame, 6'1", 175, according to 247. And yeah, I mean, look, when you're Vanderbilt, what you can sell more than anything else is the ability to get on the field in the SEC. And I don't know if it's going to go great right from day one, but I do think he has a chance to pop.
Yeah, play at Vanderbilt. You get to play name brand teams. It's awesome. And you get a Vanderbilt education. Let's be 100% clear about that. But yeah, it's like, come join our program. You get to play against all these teams you've heard of before you decided to become a recruit. But I love Vanderbilt. I have a lot of warm feelings to the Commodores because they've been a fun program to work with on other projects. One other name I'm just going to throw out there because speaking of big shoe to fill, or shoes, I mean the last person had 2 legs. Reese Dakin, another Aussie punter, going to Iowa to replace Torrey Taylor. Like, that's a guy who we're expecting this play from day one, but my goodness, that's a big kicking shoe to fill, to be the punter at Iowa. And now who knows? Maybe the offense we'll see some changes. And now that Brian's no longer there, we got a new offensive coordinator. But yeah, I just want to say, like, a lot of attention is going to be on the golden foot of the new Aussie punter at Iowa, because that's a big role, and that's something where that person, especially if things go even a percentage of how it went last season, he's going to get a lot of practice. So we think about him. I just want to throw out a fun one.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think here's the issue, right? Is that you're going to be held to the standard of one of the greatest punters of all time, in Torrey Taylor. So it's big shoes to fill, like you mentioned, at least one big leg to fill. And you mentioned maybe they'll just be better on offense to compensate. Good luck with that. We'll see what happens. It is. Go ahead. It is funny, just real quick. I remember I got to cover Michael Dixon when he was at Texas. And that was when I got punter pilled. That's when I was like, oh, okay. So like really good punting actually can change everything. And, Michael Dixon, he actually won MVP of the Texas Bowl back in 2018. I think they were playing Missouri that year. And Torrey Taylor was that kind of player. He just constantly kept teams inside the 10-yard line. He didn't have many touchbacks. Like, he's an unbelievable player, of course. And I mean, if they have just a good punter and not like a top 5 punter in the nation, I legitimately think that impacts their ability to go out and win 10 games like they did last year.
I do remember one of the funnier kind of punter situations in college football as I've been watching it was 2004 USC, because Tom Malone was their punter. and he couldn't qualify for the Ray Guy Award because he didn't punt enough. But his punting average was was way beyond everyone else's. So to me, that was like the example of just kicking the other team while they're down, quite literally. Because if you do not allow the USC to score a touchdown, they were just killing you in the punting game. And their defense and the Pete Carroll defense was exceptional. So it was absolutely ridiculous what they were doing to teams when he was on there. Yeah.
I will say, they better be right about this Reese Dakin kid, because he was the number 2 punter in the country, according to 247. The number 1 punter in the country, Drew Miller from Iowa. So if they passed on an Iowa homegrown kid who went to Georgia, by the way, I don't know, man. You better get this right. This could be the thing that finally sinks Kirk Ferentz if he misses on the Iowan punter.
Oh, I love it. I absolutely love it. Well, so many good guys to look out for. Can't wait to see some spring games as they come up here. I think this is a good guide for folks at home, an opportunity to kind of figure out what to look for and some names to look for as we head in the next season. I wanted to take a second to wrap this up and thank all of you for listening. Thank our producer, Joey Aliberti, and be sure to like, rate, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us on X and TikTok at CFB Survivor Show. He's Shehan Raja. You can find his work at CBSSports.com. Read his article. It's a good one. I enjoyed it. And you can, of course, find him on X and TikTok at Shehan Raja. I'm Bobak Hayeri. You can find me as part of Reddit CFB. Thanks for listening, everybody. Take care.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.